May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. While millions celebrated across the liberated continent, in a command post near Regensburg, Germany, Lieutenant General George S. Patton stared at maps that showed something his superiors desperately wished to ignore. The thick red line marking Soviet positions stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic, a curtain of communist power now occupying the very heart of Europe. Through the window, his Third Army tanks sat idle, their engines silent after the greatest armored campaign in military history. Just 50 kilometers east, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces consolidated control over territories that would remain enslaved for nearly half a century. Patton's hands clenched the desk edge as he studied intelligence reports detailing Soviet troop movements, radio intercepts, and prisoner interrogations. What he saw confirmed his darkest suspicions. Stalin had no intention of withdrawing from Eastern Europe. The promises made at Yalta were worthless paper, and every day of Allied inaction allowed the Red Army to strengthen its stranglehold on Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The general picked up his pen and began writing words that would soon place him under surveillance, cost him his command, and possibly his life. We may have been fighting the wrong enemy all along, but while we're here, we should go after the bastards now, because we're going to have to fight them eventually. Patton was not alone in recognizing the Soviet threat. 3,000 miles away in London, Winston Churchill harbored identical concerns, though expressed with characteristic British understatement rather than Patton's profane directness. The Prime Minister understood that the Grand Alliance, forged in desperate necessity against Nazi Germany, was fracturing before the smoke of battle had cleared. Stalin's armies occupied everything east of the Elbe River, and Soviet intentions grew clearer with each passing day. Churchill had watched with growing alarm as the Red Army consolidated control over liberated territories, installing puppet governments and crushing any opposition with methods that would have impressed the departed Gestapo. The relationship between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had always been one of expedient convenience rather than genuine partnership. From 1939 to 1941, Stalin had been Hitler's accomplice, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact dividing Poland between two totalitarian empires while the world watched in horror. Soviet forces invaded Finland in November 1939, seized the Baltic states in 1940, and annexed Romanian territory with German blessing. Only Hitler's betrayal in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa's 3 million German troops crashing across Soviet borders, drove Stalin into reluctant alliance with Britain and America. Throughout the war, mutual suspicion festered beneath diplomatic cooperation's surface. The Soviets accused the West of deliberately delaying the Second Front to bleed the Red Army white, while Britain and America secured their own interests. Churchill and Roosevelt questioned whether Stalin would honor any agreement once Germany fell, noting how communist parties in liberated territories immediately began maneuvering for power. Stalin's territorial demands at Tehran and Yalta made clear that Soviet participation in defeating Hitler came with a price measured in conquered nations and subjugated peoples. Now, in May 1945, those suspicions crystallized into certainty as Soviet occupation forces consolidated control through methods indistinguishable from Nazi brutality. The seeds of conflict had been planted at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered in the Crimean Palace to divide the post-war world. Roosevelt wanted Soviet help against Japan. Churchill demanded free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin, whose armies occupied everything from Warsaw to Vienna, insisted on a Soviet sphere of influence. The resulting agreements divided Germany into 4 occupation zones and promised free elections in liberated territories. Within weeks, Stalin's true intentions became clear as communist governments seized power throughout Eastern Europe. By April 1945, as Allied forces converged on Germany from east and west, the political landscape of post-war Europe was being determined not by diplomatic agreements, but by which army controlled which territory when the fighting stopped. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, faced agonizing choices between military objectives and political realities. His armies could reach Berlin before the Soviets, possibly Prague as well, but at what cost in American lives? The Yalta agreements had already assigned both cities to Soviet occupation zones. Fighting for objectives that would have to be surrendered later seemed pointless waste to Eisenhower, whose primary concern was ending the war with minimum Allied casualties. The Supreme Commander's decision to halt at the Elbe River rather than race for Berlin reflected military logic, but ignored political consequences. Berlin's capture would cost an estimated 100,000 American casualties, according to staff estimates. The Soviet armies already occupied positions closer to the German capital and seemed willing to pay any price in blood to capture Hitler's fortress city. Why should American boys die for territory Roosevelt had already promised to Stalin? Eisenhower chose to halt and let the Red Army take Berlin at horrific cost to itself. The decision was militarily sound, but strategically catastrophic, establishing Soviet domination of Central Europe's political heart. Patton violently disagreed with this decision. On April 14, 1945, as his Third Army raced through Bavaria and into Austria, he received orders from General Omar Bradley to halt his advance toward Prague. The Czechoslovak capital lay practically defenseless, its liberation within grasp of American armor. Churchill personally urged Eisenhower to reconsider, warning that Prague represented the political heart of Central Europe. If Soviet forces took the city, Czechoslovakia would fall under communist control with devastating consequences for post-war stability. Eisenhower consulted with Soviet commanders, who insisted American forces stop at Plzeň, 50 miles west of Prague. The Supreme Commander acquiesced, prioritizing alliance unity over strategic advantage. Patton nearly erupted with rage. In his diary, he wrote words that captured his fundamental disagreement with Eisenhower's cautious diplomacy. "I felt, and still feel, that we should have gone on to the Moldau River, and if the Russians didn't like it, let them go to hell." The general understood what Washington and Schaff headquarters seemed to miss. Military victory over Germany meant nothing if it delivered half of Europe to Soviet tyranny. Better to confront Stalin now, while American armies stood at full strength in the heart of Europe, than to face the inevitable conflict later from positions of weakness. The Prague Uprising of May 5, 1945, crystallized Patton's frustration. Czech resistance seized the radio station and broadcast desperate appeals for American help. German SS units counterattacked with tanks while Patton's forces sat 50 miles away, prohibited from intervening. For 3 days, civilians built 1,600 barricades and fought in the streets. Soviet forces finally entered Prague on May 9th, after thousands of Czechs had died, fighting for liberation that American armor could have provided in hours. Berlin's fall proved even grimmer. Soviet forces took the capital in late April after losing 80,000 men in street fighting. The Red Army then unleashed systematic revenge on civilians. Rape became policy. Looting was universal. Patton later wrote his wife describing intelligence reports. Berlin gave me the blues. We have destroyed what could have been a good race and are replacing them with Mongolian savages. For the first week after they took it, all women who ran were shot, and those who did not were raped. I could have taken it instead had I been allowed. The general's language reflected the prejudices of his era and class, but his core assessment proved tragically accurate. The Western Allies had made a devil's bargain, accepting Soviet brutality as the price of defeating Nazi Germany. Now that Germany lay crushed, Stalin moved to consolidate his wartime gains into permanent empire. Poland, promised free elections at Yalta, instead received a Soviet puppet government based in Lublin that crushed any opposition with methods borrowed from the NKVD. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually East Germany followed the same pattern. Democratic leaders were arrested, communist parties seized control, and the Iron Curtain descended across Europe. Patton watched this unfolding catastrophe with mounting rage and determination to act before it was too late. On May 7, 1945, the day Germany formally surrendered at Reims, Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson visited Patton's headquarters to discuss post-war occupation policy and assess conditions in the American zone. The two men walked through devastated German towns where civilians picked through rubble, searching for food and shelter. Patterson asked Patton his assessment of the Soviet situation. The general's response was recorded by multiple witnesses and later appeared in official documents that would haunt his final months. "Let's keep our boots polished, bayonets sharpened, and present a picture of force and strength to these people," Patton declared, gesturing toward the east, where Soviet forces occupied German territory. "This is the only language they understand and respect. If you fail to do this, then I would like to say to you that we have had a victory over the Germans and have disarmed them, but have lost the war." He continued with growing intensity. "We came here to give them back the right to govern themselves. We promised the Europeans freedom. It would be worse than dishonorable not to see that they have it. This might mean war with the Russians, but what of it? We must either finish the job now, while we are here and ready, or later in less favorable circumstances." Patterson reported this conversation to Secretary of War Henry Stimson and to President Harry Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April. The reaction in Washington ranged from alarm to outright panic. The war had just ended after 6 years of global conflict that had killed over 60 million people. American factories were already beginning the conversion from military to civilian production. Millions of American soldiers demanded immediate demobilization and return home. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for rapid drawdown of military forces and a return to peacetime economy. The American people had sacrificed enormously to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. They had no appetite for another war, particularly against an ally who had suffered 25 million casualties defeating the Wehrmacht. The disconnect between public perception and military reality created an impossible situation for American leadership. Eisenhower understood the Soviet threat, but prioritized alliance management and orderly occupation over confrontation with a recent ally. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, faced the enormous challenge of finishing the Pacific War while managing the occupation of Germany, Italy, Austria, and Japan while demobilizing millions of soldiers. President Truman, in office barely a month, was still learning the complexities of international diplomacy while managing the transition from war to peace. None of them wanted to hear Patton's apocalyptic warnings about inevitable conflict with the Soviets, or his solution of rearming German units and marching east toward Moscow. To exhausted leaders, focused on managing victory's immediate aftermath, Patton's proposals struck them as not merely impractical, but dangerously insane. Yet Patton was not alone. Winston Churchill reached identical conclusions. On May 8, 1945, while the world celebrated, Churchill ordered his military chiefs to develop a contingency plan for war with the Soviet Union. The resulting document, classified top secret and codenamed Operation Unthinkable, represented the most extraordinary war plan ever seriously considered. The Joint Planning Staff analyzed force dispositions and strategic objectives through May 1945. Churchill wanted to know if Western military power could force Stalin to withdraw and grant independence to Eastern Europe. The planners proposed a surprise attack launching July 1, 1945, striking Soviet positions from Hamburg to Trieste. Success required overwhelming force and German cooperation, assuming recruitment of Wehrmacht units to supplement Western armies. The numbers told a sobering story. Western forces would deploy 103 divisions against 264 Soviet divisions, totaling over 6.5 million men. The Red Army outnumbered Western forces more than 2-1, with 4 years of brutal combat experience. Soviet forces occupied defensive positions throughout Eastern Europe, with supply lines to intact industrial centers. Western forces would attack across devastated terrain, with supply lines stretching to Channel ports. The Joint Planning Staff delivered their assessment in late May. Operation Unthinkable could not achieve its objectives. Even with initial surprise, the Red Army would counterattack with overwhelming force. The war would consume casualties exceeding those just concluded. Soviet forces might reach the English Channel. The plan was, in their assessment, truly unthinkable in its strategic recklessness. George Patton remained unaware of Operation Unthinkable, but his thinking followed parallel lines. The general's anti-Soviet rhetoric escalated through summer 1945. Wiretaps revealed disturbing conversations. Patton spoke about creating incidents to justify war. He advocated rearming Wehrmacht units to help force the Red Army back into Russia. In one recorded conversation, he allegedly told General Joseph McNarney, "In 10 days I can have enough incidents happen to have us at war with those sons of bitches and make it look like their fault." His assessment of Soviet capabilities grew divorced from reality. The American army could beat the Russians with the greatest of ease, because while the Russians have good infantry, they are lacking in artillery, air, tanks, and in the knowledge of combined arms. This ignored intelligence showing Soviet artillery had devastated German positions, that Soviet armor matched Western designs, that Soviet combined arms doctrine had evolved through 4 years of warfare into arguably the most effective in the world. Patton's behavior at social functions proved equally problematic. At May 1945 victory celebrations, when Soviet General Mikhail Katakov proposed a toast, Patton had his translator say, "Tell him I will not drink with him or any other Russian son of a bitch." Soviet officers reported this to Stalin, who filed it as evidence of Western perfidy. By September 1945, Patton's statements had become serious liabilities. He opposed blanket removal of former Nazi party members from authority positions, arguing most Germans joined for convenience rather than ideology. "The Nazi thing is just like a Democratic-Republican election fight," he told reporters, demonstrating tone deafness to Nazi criminality's moral dimensions. Eisenhower found Patton's statements intolerable. On October 2, 1945, he relieved Patton of 3rd Army Command and assigned him to the 15th Army, a paper organization compiling historical records. The general who had terrified Wehrmacht commanders now found his career ended. In letters to his wife, he expressed determination to tell Americans the truth. "When I finish this job, around the first of the year, I shall resign, not retire, because if I retire, I will still have a gag in my mouth." The prospect of Patton's unfiltered opinions alarmed numerous parties, preferring his continued silence. On December 9, 1945, Patton accepted an invitation from General Hobart Gay to go pheasant hunting near his headquarters in Bad Nauheim, Germany. The general's regular driver, Master Sergeant John Mims, had returned to the United States months earlier after years of safely driving Patton through combat zones. His replacement, 19-year-old Private Horace Woodring from Kentucky, had a less stellar record, having been demoted 3 times during his military service. Patton initially sat in the front passenger seat of the 1938 Cadillac sedan, but stopped the convoy to retrieve a hunting dog from a following jeep. Concerned that the dog was suffering from cold in the open vehicle, Patton moved to the rear seat to accommodate the animal in front, where heat from the engine would keep it warm. The route to the hunting grounds took them through Mannheim on a narrow 2-lane road lined with debris from years of bombing and fighting. Burned-out vehicles sat abandoned on both sides. Building rubble spilled into the street. At 11:45 a.m., as the Cadillac traveled at approximately 35 miles per hour, Patton remarked to Gay about the wreckage. "How awful war is. Think of the waste." At that moment, a 2.5-ton GMC truck loaded with supplies turned left from a quartermaster depot directly into their path without warning. Woodring had no time to brake or swerve. The truck struck the right passenger side of the Cadillac with enough force to crumple the body panels, but not to seriously damage the vehicle's structure. General Gay and Private Woodring suffered only minor injuries from being shaken in the collision, neither man requiring hospitalization. George Patton, sitting directly behind the driver in the back seat, was thrown forward by the impact. He struck his head violently on the metal railing above the driver's seat, suffering a deep gash across his forehead that exposed the skull bone beneath. More critically, the impact compressed his cervical spine, fracturing the 3rd and 4th vertebrae and severing his spinal cord. The general immediately realized the catastrophic extent of his injuries. He tried to move but could not. He asked Gay to work his fingers, then shouted in frustration when he felt nothing. "Go ahead, Hap. Work my fingers," he commanded desperately. Gay tried to comply, rubbing Patton's hands vigorously, but the general remained completely paralyzed from the neck down. The warrior, who had commanded armies across 3 continents, now lay helpless in the wreckage of a routine traffic accident. An ambulance rushed Patton to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, 12 miles from the accident site. The medical team stabilized his condition and assessed the horrific damage. The spinal cord injury was complete, meaning Patton would never walk again, never regain use of his arms or legs, never return to any semblance of his former life. The general who had faced German artillery, tank attacks, and airstrikes without flinching, now confronted an enemy he could not fight with courage or tactical brilliance. Paralysis offered no targets to assault, no flanks to turn, no weak points to exploit. It was, as he would later observe, a hell of a way to die. Beatrice Patton flew from Boston to be at her husband's bedside, maintaining constant vigil, while doctors tried to manage his deteriorating condition. For 12 days, she watched as the man who had seemed indestructible slowly declined. Patton could speak and could breathe with assistance. He maintained consciousness for brief periods, discussing matters with his wife and closest aides. He understood his prognosis with the same clarity that had marked his combat assessments throughout his career. When told he would never ride a horse again, never lead troops, never live independently, he responded with characteristic directness. "This is a hell of a way to die." The medical complications multiplied despite the best available treatment. On December 21, 1945, Patton developed a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that migrated from his paralyzed legs through his circulatory system to his lungs. His breathing became labored. The oxygen saturation in his blood dropped dangerously. Doctors administered supplemental oxygen and attempted to stabilize his heart function, but the damage proved irreversible. At 5:50 p.m., 12 days after the accident that had paralyzed him, General George Smith Patton, Jr. died of congestive heart failure and pulmonary complications. He was 60 years old, cut down not by enemy action, but by a traffic accident in occupied Germany. The official explanation of a routine traffic accident satisfied most contemporary observers, but convinced no one who understood the political context of Patton's death or the general's recent history of narrowly avoided fatal accidents. The general had made powerful enemies through his anti-Soviet rhetoric and his threatened expose of Allied decision-making during the war. Soviet intelligence services, particularly the NKVD, had eliminated troublesome individuals with far less provocation than Patton provided through his public statements and private threats. American intelligence agencies, increasingly focused on managing the transition to Cold War, possessed both the capability and potential motive to silence a general whose public statements could undermine delicate post-war diplomacy. The circumstances of the accident, involving a substitute driver with a questionable military record and a truck that appeared at precisely the right moment to intercept Patton's vehicle, struck conspiracy theorists as too convenient to be coincidental. The case for assassination gained superficial plausibility from several factors. Patton had been involved in multiple near-fatal accidents in the months before his death, suggesting either remarkable bad luck or systematic targeting. In one incident documented by Patton himself, an ox cart pole nearly struck him in the head while he rode in a jeep through German streets. He commented afterward with apparent premonition, "God, what a fate that would have been, to have gone through all the war I've seen and been killed by an ox." His new driver, Private Woodring, lacked the experience and flawless safety record of Sergeant Mims, who had driven Patton safely through combat zones for years without a single accident. The truck driver who caused the collision was never disciplined or even seriously questioned about his failure to yield right-of-way. Both drivers were quickly sent back to their units as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet the evidence for assassination theories remains entirely circumstantial and unconvincing to serious historians who have examined the available documentation. Carlo d'Este, Patton's most thorough and respected biographer, addressed the speculation with appropriate skepticism born from years of archival research. Those who suggest that Patton was somehow murdered have failed to provide the slightest evidence of how anyone could have planned such a caper, or ensured that Patton's Cadillac would be momentarily stopped for the passage of a train at the crossing, just down the street from the scene of the accident. Other than a handful of men on his personal staff, no one even knew where Patton would be, what route he would follow, or what time he would arrive at his destination. The logistics of arranging an assassination disguised as a traffic accident, involving split-second timing and the cooperation of multiple parties who would all need to remain silent forever, exceeded the capabilities of even the most sophisticated intelligence services. The more mundane reality, though, less dramatic than conspiracy theories, better fits the available evidence. Patton had survived 4 years of combat by a combination of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and extraordinary luck. That luck ran out on a quiet German road in December 1945, victim of the same random chance that claims thousands of lives in traffic accidents every year. The accident that killed Patton resulted from a combination of unfortunate circumstances: an inexperienced driver, a truck turning without warning, and split-second timing rather than elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by shadowy forces seeking to silence an inconvenient truth-teller. Patton's death removed from the scene the most vocal American advocate for immediate confrontation with the Soviet Union. Churchill remained politically active but lost the July 1945 election, replaced by Labour Party leader Clement Attlee, who had no interest in pursuing Operation Unthinkable. The atomic bomb, successfully tested in July 1945 and deployed against Japan in August, provided leverage against Soviet expansion, but could not roll back existing occupation. The division of Europe that Patton and Churchill had tried desperately to prevent became the defining feature of the Cold War that dominated international relations for the next 45 years. History ultimately vindicated Patton's assessment of Soviet intentions, if not his proposed solution. Stalin never withdrew from Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany became Soviet satellites ruled through terror. The Hungarian Uprising of 1956 and Prague Spring of 1968 showed any attempt to loosen Soviet control would be crushed by tanks. The Iron Curtain divided families and nations until the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Would Patton's plan have worked? Military analysis suggests not. Operation Unthinkable's planners concluded Western forces lacked numerical superiority to defeat the Red Army. Logistical challenges of sustaining offensives into Eastern Europe exceeded anything attempted against Germany. Soviet forces would defend territory conquered at enormous cost, with potentially greater determination than against the Wehrmacht. The war could have dragged on for years, destroying public support in democracies while Stalin's totalitarian control faced no such constraints. The atomic bomb might have altered calculations if employed immediately and ruthlessly. Nuclear strikes against Moscow could have decapitated Soviet leadership. But this required moral calculus democratic leaders in 1945 were unwilling to embrace. Having just defeated Nazi Germany, Western democracies weren't prepared to inaugurate the atomic age with mass murder of Soviet civilians who had been allies weeks earlier. Patton's fundamental error lay not in assessing Soviet intentions, but believing military force could resolve an essentially political problem. Europe's division resulted from Yalta decisions when Soviet armies already occupied the territories. Rolling back that occupation through conventional warfare would have required resources and political will. Western democracies did not possess in 1945. The debate illuminates persistent tension in American strategic thinking. When does prudent caution become dangerous appeasement? When does necessary confrontation become reckless warmongering? Patton believed confronting Stalin in 1945 from strength would prevent more dangerous conflict later from weakness. His superiors believed accepting Soviet occupation was regrettable but necessary for maintaining peace and allowing demobilization. Both perspectives contained truth and wishful thinking. The Cold War proved Patton correct about conflict's inevitability, but vindicated Eisenhower's caution about its form. Nuclear deterrence, proxy wars, and ideological competition eventually exhausted the Soviet system without triggering the global thermonuclear war Patton's approach might have precipitated. Whether Eastern Europe's liberation could have been achieved at lower cost through early confrontation remains unanswerable. A counterfactual military historians will debate forever. George Patton was buried Christmas Eve, 1945, at Luxembourg American Cemetery, joining over 5,000 American soldiers. His grave faces those of men he led through World War II's bloodiest campaigns, as if leading them once more. The cross bears no mention of controversial final months, no reference to warnings about the Soviet threat. He rests among his soldiers, remembered for victories achieved rather than battles never fought. Patton's legacy extends beyond whether war with the Soviets in 1945 was wise or achievable. His warnings about Soviet intentions proved prescient, even if his solution was impractical. His frustration at watching Eastern Europe fall under communist control reflected genuine moral outrage at betrayal of people's promised liberation. His belief that military force should serve political objectives challenged comfortable assumptions of leaders preferring accommodation to confrontation. Today, as we study the Cold War that dominated 1945 to 1991, Patton's warnings resonate with uncomfortable clarity. The general, whose statements cost him his command, proved correct about Soviet intentions. The division he tried to prevent lasted 45 years, ending only with Soviet system collapse. The war he advocated never occurred, replaced by decades of tension, bringing humanity repeatedly to annihilation's edge. Whether his approach would have produced better outcomes remains unknowable, but his warnings deserved more serious consideration than leaders focused on demobilization provided. Remember to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories that shaped our world. The story of Patton's forbidden plan reminds us that history's paths not taken sometimes matter as much as those we followed, and that 1945's debates continue echoing in strategic thinking today.